Botanical art or botanical painting, it's a lovely, comfortable space. It just opens up another world to you. Just painting something that is so utterly beautiful and breathtaking, a fading peony or, just the most exquisite rose that you can imagine, to sort of raise awareness, if you like, of the beauty that is the natural world. I'm just one of many that are just trying to bring the natural world into focus. Hi, I'm Billy Showell and I'm a botanical painter, and I'm here at the Jackson studio to talk about my life and my work. My dad was a graphic artist, so I grew up in a house where there were lots of art materials, and I was always that sort of quiet child that would sit in the corner drawing and painting. So I've always been interested in art and loved it all the time I was at junior school. And then when I went to secondary school, I sort of went away from art and thought about other things. When I was thinking about leaving school, I thought, actually, I fancy going to art school and maybe studying fashion. So I did a 2-year foundation course at Epsom Art School. And then I followed that by going to St Martin's for a 3-year design and illustration course. I think I was quite shy at school, and when I got into the sort of later part of school, I decided when I was going to do art that I would take it up with the headmaster, because the school didn't encourage art. And there's a funny story where I went into the headmaster's office to say goodbye to the school, and he asked me why I hadn't concentrated on sciences, and I said that I wanted to be an artist. And he said that there wasn't that much of a career in art. And I pointed out to him that everything that he was wearing, the car that he drove to the office, the building that he was sitting in, had probably all been designed by somebody that probably started off at art school. And I think he was a bit taken back. So I sort of got a little bit more emboldened. And I guess once I got to art school and I found my people, as it were, suddenly, the whole world sort of opened up to me as to what I could do. So I got into St Martin's, which was fantastic, a really exciting time of my life. And when I got there, I realised what an intense course it was, because there were so many different people on the course, all living and breathing fashion. And I suddenly thought, actually, I should be living and breathing fashion. And it didn't really occur to me right at the beginning that I wasn't really a fashion person, because I just loved illustration and designing clothes. It just seemed really a natural fit for me. And I loved doing the work. I was there every day. I was one of those students that was there till late working. And the part of it that I really, really liked was the illustration side of it. When I had a critique of my work right at the end of college, that was the thing that was spoken about the most, is that, I should have gone and done an illustration course as opposed to the fashion course. So when I left college, I went and worked in the high street fashion scene, and I had this job working in Wallace. I guess I was there probably about 2.5 years, not very long. And it was quite a sort of formative time in my life, because I had met my husband, then boyfriend. He was working as a model maker, and there were opportunities to do work outside of my job. So if a job came up where they needed somebody to sculpt a little figure or make some clothes for a shot, or even to do some illustration, then he would put me forward and I would do little jobs like that. And it was quite good, because it sort of took me out of my comfort zone. But it also gave me a sort of window, a way of thinking what else I could do rather than doing fashion. Towards the end of my time at Wallace, my husband had left model making and become a specialist decorator. And he was doing all kinds of sort of murals and things like that. And I think one day I just turned up and I said, my feet hurt. I don't want to go to work anymore. I want to be an illustrator. So we sort of thought about it, thought it's a bit risky because I won't have any money. But we decided that, I should leave and try and work as a freelance illustrator. So I really didn't start teaching till quite a long way through being sort of freelance, as it were. I was painting on furniture, and then somebody said to me, well, if you can paint those beautiful flowers on furniture, why don't you paint it onto canvas? So I'd started with oil paints, really, just as something to do. And I started painting sort of classic still lives. I had a show up in Lincolnshire, actually. It was my in-laws who were both art teachers, and they had a little group, and we put on a show there, and this chap said, I'll be your agent. Whatever you paint, send it to me and I'll sell it. So that's what I started doing. So I started painting in oils, doing these still lives. But it wasn't enough income. Obviously, being a selling artist, you need to sell a lot to make a good living. So I thought, well, actually, maybe I could start teaching this oil painting. So I took myself down to the local adult ed and I presented myself as this oil painting art teacher. And I think there was like an open evening where you could sit and get people to sign up for your classes. And I don't think anybody came to my desk, and I came home quite sort of deflated and a bit miserable. So anyway, I think that summer I decided that I will start painting watercolour. All that year I practiced, and then I went back and I said to them, maybe I could teach watercolour. And I sat at the table waiting for everyone to sign up, and suddenly I was surrounded by people and I got loads of people signed up to my course. And I think probably I was only a few steps ahead of them when I started teaching, but I just had this feeling that this was something I was really going to be good at. You know, I just had that funny feeling that I'd found a little niche that suited me. And of course, I could teach in the evening and look after the kids during the day. So that was my next phase in life. So I fell into botanical illustration quite by chance, really. I'd been teaching evening classes in general sort of watercolour and still life. The head of the Adult Education Centre said, could you run a course on botanical painting or botanical illustration? And I seriously said to him, what's that? So I had to zip down to the library to find out what he was talking about. When I went to the library, I found several books on it, and I just thought, gosh, this is lovely because it's just painting the plant and you don't have to paint any backgrounds. And I quite like the way all the focus was on the plant. When you're looking at something so intensely and analysing a plant, you're seeing things that you'd never would take any notice of in normal day-to-day life. You don't see that petals are fused at the base and then burst open. You don't see how the mechanics of the flower work. You don't see how the leaves attach and that things are covered in minute hairs or that that's sticky or whatever. And there's all these wonderful things, especially for children, that sort of ignite their imagination, and you can make it really good fun to sort of learn about painting and art through looking at plants. I think looking at my career as a botanical illustrator is different to my career as a botanical artist, and I'll just describe the difference. So botanical illustrators, if they're employed in an official capacity, are illustrating plants for archives, so they have to follow a specific plan of how the painting is laid out, and it is a way of identifying plants. So if you were out in the field, you would have a really good description and painting to go by. And botanical painting is more sort of taking that skill, if you like, of portraying a plant beautifully and accurately, but there's a little bit more artistic license in it. I was pushing my watercolour skills, but I wasn't pushing the sort of the scientific side of things. And I think I've always been erring on the how can I make this painting look really beautiful and interesting? People have lots of really weird opinions about botanical art, which can be sort of, that it's a bit not very expressive, but there are so many little elements of my life that go into my paintings. It's definitely a genre that's growing, and I think as long as it's got its feet in history, it can have its head in the clouds. So I've always resisted calling myself a botanical artist, and I know that sounds strange because that's what I am, but I sort of didn't want to be considered that scientific or sort of being held into a particular bracket. I wanted to be a painter. I still think of myself as an artist. I'm in a group of artists who choose flowers from unusual angles and moments in time. There are some amazing artists that do sort of fading flowers and what have you. So I sort of look at their shape and their colour, and I put them together in a way that I think looks really beautiful. I have like themes that I put my paintings into. So I'll have a sort of spirally theme where I'm sort of working flowers in a spiral pattern, or squares, or twisting things, looking underneath things. So that's where my creativity comes into within the genre, if you like. So it's still an accurate portrait of the plant, but maybe that's not the most important thing about the painting, but the overall shape and colour. So I really like that, and I'm really exploring what it is, those different ideas that I have at the moment. And I think there's room in the botanical world for that, because it's still celebrating the beautiful forms that the natural world give us. So I need to talk about the Society of Botanical Artists, because this was a society where I went to their first show and I couldn't believe the quality of the work there. They were huge shows, and they're at the Central Westminster Gallery, and it was overwhelming when you looked at all of this stuff. And you know, the painters that I met there, some of them were some of the loveliest people ever, because they were very sort of guiding and motherly towards me, and sort of helped me. I went along to the first exhibition, and I always remember going up to the desk and I said, "Oh, I'd like to join, please." And they said, "Well, you can't just join, you have to apply." And I said, "Well, how do I apply then?" So they gave me the application form. You had to produce 5 highly detailed paintings and get them accepted in the show 3 years running. So it was quite a difficult task. And people have been trying to get in for years. You know, it was really strict. Although the society itself was quite a broad range of design and art in there, the panel that allowed you in were quite strict. So I applied. I think I got in on the second year of applying. And I think I broke all of the rules. Now, there are certain rules with botanical illustration. Going back in time, you have to, you paint it the actual size. If you're going to enlarge it, you put certain symbols next to it to say how much you've enlarged it. There are these little rules. So when my work was first exhibited there, because my name was spelt with a Y, Billy with a Y, they didn't know that I was female. So I could stand the other side of the painting and listen to what they were saying about my work. And they would say, "He's broken all the rules, but somehow it works." So I was like really fascinated by these rules that I'd broken. I got chatting to some of the other artists there, and they were saying, well, the lovely thing is that the compositions that I put together are really unique. And I hadn't realised that I was doing something different. And I always have this sort of like thing in my head that if you analyse something too much, you break it. So I thought, well, I won't analyse it. I'll just continue what I'm doing because it's getting work onto the wall. So I would say I've been a member now of the SBA for over 20 years. It was quite fundamental in my journey, because meeting other artists, discussing paper, plants, all of those things that you needed to know was really, really helpful. So watercolour is one of those mediums where you need really good pigments. You do really need to buy the best, and then you can get the results that you want. So keeping your palette small but buying the best materials, I always think is the best way to go. And I've been using the same colours for a long time. I did start off with Winsor & Newton, but now I work with Sennelier, and I really love their range of colours. And I've chosen most of my palette to be transparent and light fast, which is also important. But I throw in the odd little colour every now and then, just because you find it and you love it. And I think that's the way you should work as an artist. I think, you shouldn't restrict yourself too much. And then you can build up your palette and create the colours that suit you. With my brushes, I used to use sable brushes, but I moved over 7 or 8 years ago to synthetic brushes. Ethical reasons, I think, but also I wanted something that was maybe just a little bit more springy. I was looking for more spring in my brush. So I use synthetic brushes, and I have a set of tool brushes that I use. Now, the tool brushes I have a really large brush, which I call a divine wash brush, which is basically for when I do really big paintings. I want a brush that holds a lot of water. Then I have a brush, which I call a mixing brush, which is basically a brush that gets all the abuse when I'm mixing the colours. And then I go down into my little brushes, my little tool brushes. So I have a fine liner, which is a very tiny little one-stroke brush, which is very good for, actually I use that for dry brushing very small areas. So that's really good for that. It's very good for fine lines. I have my eradicator brush, which is my brush that removes all mistakes, most of them. And then I have a really tiny new brush called a spotter. And I think a lot of people are aware of spotters. It's just a teeny weeny brush just for getting all those nice little spots on the flowers and not sort of making lines instead of spots. So paper is an obsession with botanical painters. One tends to sort of have your favourites that you go to. And I've gone through quite a lot, I think, if not all of them. And I've settled on Saunders Waterford hot pressed. That's the high white. And it's actually quite important because originally I used to use the traditional white, which has a colour to it, slightly sort of off-white creamy colour. But when you're printing your paintings or doing sort of cards or publishing them, sometimes that colour is red as a colour in the printer. So it doesn't give it that lovely, clean, pristine white background that we look for in botanical art. And we tend to always use hot pressed, although sometimes it's quite nice to use cold pressed when you're just practicing and getting to know the botanical processes. The difficulty is the more textured the paper, the harder it is to get the really crisp outlines of the plants. Usually I would go for sort of like a 100% cotton paper. Certainly when I'm painting artwork for an archive, then it needs to be on cotton paper, 100% cotton paper. But there are loads of papers out there now. The wood-free paper, Bockingford, that I use is quite nice just for, sort of general practicing. As long as the surface is nice and you don't overwork it, there are lots of options out there. Historically speaking, a lot of botanical illustration was done with a process called dry brushing, where you're just using a very small amount of paint and very small brushes and just applying the paint very, very delicately. Even over large areas, they would just use this very slow, small brush process. Because I came to botanical painting through my fashion illustration background, I obviously used a process called wet in wet. So when I was doing my fashion illustrations, you have to work quite fast. And so you would work with quite wet paint. And moving on from that, when I wanted to get that lovely sort of blend of light to dark and catching the highlights on, say, petals and leaves, I thought, well, the only way I can do this on hot press paper is to add water first. Religiously, I always add water first to my area that I'm painting and then drop the colour into it. Not only is this a faster way of working than the traditional way, it's also something that celebrates the medium that I'm using, because sometimes the watercolour can create the texture much better than I could, and it gives it a lovely softness, especially when you're doing sort of rose petals or peony petals, and you can get this wonderful graduation of light to dark and get lovely soft edges. So the wet in wet technique is something that I think I'll always use. Something that some colours can do is called granulation, which is where you get this sort of slightly textured finish, almost like little spots of colour in amongst a nice smooth glaze. And some colours are notorious for it. I think French Ultramarine is one of the colours that granulates, and people talk about Cobalt Blue granulating. And if somebody said to me I couldn't use French Ultramarine or Cobalt Blue, I'd probably run to the hills screaming, because they're my favourite colours. So I think if something difficult happens in the wash, there are ways of sweeping it smooth again. But sometimes you get a little bit of granulation and it's just the perfect texture for that plant. So there's a little bit of happy accident that happens. So I'm really lucky, and my husband built me a studio on the foundations of an old polytunnel. I probably should have kept the polytunnel, but the studio is more useful. And it is a really lovely space that I can teach small classes in, and have a very long desk that I found at an old antique shop, which I think is an old desk with a lean. So I think it was for sort of like maybe accountants with big books. But anyway, that's my desk. And it always looks very chaotic, but it's organised chaos. And I suppose a normal day for me would be get the sort of business side of my work out the way, do a bit of feedback. And you need to know if you're a night owl or a morning lark. And I'm definitely a night owl. And by about 4 o'clock, I feel inspired to go to my studio and paint. So I have plenty on the go. I have different sort of folders and different drawers in the studio. That's my sort of, my crazy corner over there, or that's my very organised corner over there. And I keep, I don't really have a sketchbook, so I keep my work in acid-free folders. So I'm always thinking of the themes and I'm always playing around with the composition, but there tends to be like little stories that come together and then I'll group those together. So getting into the zone of painting, everybody has their music that they listen to and they're working to, or sound or whatever. So if I'm painting something scientific and I'm going into detail, I often have talking radio. I'm big Radio 4 fan, so I listen to that. But if I'm writing, I have to have music. And I've got into a podcast called The Morning After Mix, which is sort of different mixes of really lovely sort of chill out type music. That's good for when you're writing. I tend to listen to sort of more, guitars, just sort of gentle, pop, not pop music, more sort of indie pop music when I'm painting. And then when I'm really stressed, when I've got a big deadline, I have complete silence. Well, as silent as it can be when you're in the countryside, because there's always birds singing and that sort of ambient noise. But that's how I get into the zone. So I have different sounds for different jobs. When I'm planning a painting, sometimes it's purely organic. So I'll just go into the garden, I'll find whatever I want to paint. I place it aesthetically on the paper, hovering it just above the paper. I decide which angle I'm going to go for, and then I put it down. And somewhere in that process of getting the flowers or getting the plant material together, I have like an image in my mind of where I'm going to take it. And it doesn't always work out. And sometimes you can go through a bit of a sort of weird phase in the middle of a composition where maybe you put something in the wrong place and it's not quite going how you imagined it would go. Then you have to sort of turn the painting around, or maybe crop the paper down and make it a smaller image. So I do a lot of that. I do a lot of playing around with composition and just trying things out. The most common question that I get asked is, how long does it take to paint a painting? And it depends on the size, obviously, and it depends on the amount of detail that you're going to put in and how fussy you're going to be, and how many images you're going to put onto the piece of paper. So I tend to think about, it takes about a day to map in one flower. And when I say map in, it's sort of, getting some paint on the paper, maybe analysing some of the values across the colours for the flower and sort of getting it mapped in, I guess. And then the amount of detail or fiddling that I do, I don't even count the hours. So I'd say a majority of my sort of small to medium paintings take about a week if I was to add all of the hours together. A lot of people worry when they're painting that they're going to overwork something, and that is a risk. Obviously, when you're painting something as a sort of portrait of that particular plant and you're wanting to be really exact, it's very difficult sometimes to know when to stop. I think when you are looking at your painting, sometimes it's quite nice to stop and offer it up to the mirror. This is what I do sometimes. And I can sort of tell then, because I'm sort of looking at it back to front and I'm seeing it with fresh eyes. I often turn the painting upside down. Sometimes I'll walk away from a painting, I'll just put it away. And my students always say, if you put it away, they get it out the next day. It almost feels like some kind of magic elf has been working on it overnight, because you just see it with new eyes and it just looks better. A couple of times I have actually physically put my painting in a bin and then retrieved it later on, because I've spent so long doing it, I didn't want to throw it away. But I take it to the point where I'm happy with it. So if you were going to start a botanical painting journey, and we're going to call it a journey because it is, the The thing that I always tell people to do is start with the flowers or the plants that you love. So if you are particularly mad on houseplants, that would be where you would start. You would start painting your favourite houseplant. And then moving on from that, you've obviously got to sort of find out about colour. So keeping your palette very simple. Try mixing your greens yourself. Try drawing the plants at different angles and just basically having fun with your art. First of all, learn your techniques, learn how you're going to illustrate, find your medium, and then start branching out to find tutors to help you. And practice, obviously, is the most important thing, but when you go to practice, be in the state of mind that this is for me, this is my time. I'm going to find what I like doing and find the colours that I like mixing. So I think always go at it from that organic perspective, that this is going to be something that you enjoy doing, that you're going to sit and do for a long time, or stand and do for a long time. So really choose the plants and follow the artists that you love.